before I get ahead of myself, let me also say a few words that help to locate where I think we are, because in as much as one can look at the university as the longest standing institutions that we have, for so long as we've had them, we've also had a debate about learning versus education. And Socrates, you may remember, cherished learning, but was very suspicious of education. And so when we are dissecting the university and debating its role, what we're really talking about is what role does education, in that formal, rigid sense, play in learning, which we all are here today in agreement is a lifelong process. And it can begin at any age. My wife and I have a 2-year-old daughter, and my wife loves to begin her lectures by saying, if the universities that we have today are if the universities of today are the same and operate in the same way, 16 years from now, as they do today, we will not send our daughter to college. And that always gets people stunned, either stunned into silence or laughing, but it means a lot coming from someone like her who has several Ivy League degrees, because she really believes that the model has to change. And she is, if anything, resentful of her formal education from having taken away from her learning. And so we all share the same interest in having our educational systems contribute to our learning. Now, to set an even broader context, I want to start by talking about globalization. And the reason is that if we want to identify what the tasks, what the challenges, what the roles of the university are in the modern world, in the postmodern world, if you want to call it that, you have to understand where that is going. So it's appropriate, actually, that we look back about 1,000 years to, there we go, to globalization 1.0. It's so fashionable to put a decimal after everything today, isn't it? So globalization 1.0, 1,000 years ago, was also the time when our first modern universities, Oxford, Cambridge, and others, Paris, I think Bruges, were all founded around the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. And those universities didn't necessarily take over from, but they began to exist alongside the institutions that drove education for centuries during the early Middle Ages, and those were, of course, monasteries. Those too were institutions. So not only universities, but monasteries, churches, these are most certainly the longest standing institutions that we have that have existed longer than any modern government and will outlast most governments. I most certainly agree with the professor about that. But globalization 1.0 1,000 years ago was a very limited world. Here you have it. It was when Marco Polo made his voyages eastward to China and back. Some would include North Africa here as well, because the great Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta made a similar route. But this was the beginning of the world's first interregional commercial trading economic system. And it was on the back of that European powers began to expand the global, oops, it's clicked twice, there we go. On the back of globalization 1.0 in the Silk Road, that European powers created a colonial hierarchy, discovering and integrating, subduing the new world. But still here, Europe, particularly, of course, Holland, Spain, France, Portugal, and other countries created this not quite global hierarchy, but certainly one in which Europe was at the center. And it was on the back of that we had globalization 3.0. That was spawned by the Industrial Revolution, the technologies of the steam engine and railroads and the telegraph, which were captured by Great Britain and Northern European powers and also the United States, which created genuine economic advantage for the West. The 20th century is what I like to call globalization 4.0. We began to put rules around this global economic and political order. The World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and so forth. But what's interesting about this globalization 4.0 is that most people still believe that that's the period of history that we're in. But what you see here, because you even have the emerging markets, you have China and India, they appear on this map as well, the Persian Gulf. But this globalization 4.0, even with all of its rules and codes and standards, is not or has not been global. Just 15 countries have dominated 90% of global trade. But what is changing truly in the 21st century is that we have moved into what I call globalization 5.0. Total globalization, the information age, the hybrid age, as I like to call it. And this is a truly global phase of history, something we're experiencing for the first time. There's many people who are already sick and tired of the word globalization. They wonder if it means anything at all, or if it means everything, then it doesn't mean anything. And yet, it's really just happening for the first time. We've never had a globalization. We have it today. The playing field is becoming increasingly leveled. Just 20 years ago, many people would say the map of the world geopolitically looked like this. The United States stood at the center, a few great powers surrounded it, but basically the world's geopolitical relations were mediated by the US. That was a unipolar world, that was a centralized world administratively, and look what globalization has done in exactly 20 years. This to me is a much more accurate depiction of what the world looks like diplomatically. It's a world of regions, a world in which there is global interdependence, yes, but there is much more regional integration, which is just as important. And you have core countries leading each region, but you have and key countries surrounding them. But everyone relates to everyone else on their own terms, without any centralized power, without any centralized authority. Again, when George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, stood at the great podium of the United Nations General Assembly exactly 20 years ago, and he declared a new world order, he was talking about a world that was centralized, a world that was unipolar, a world that was run by central institutions. 2 decades later, the world is fragmented, it's multi-level, it's multi-actor, in ways where there are many companies and NGOs and universities even that matter in terms of their influence more than many countries. Let's just take the example of Apple. Apple Computers, which has $76.2 billion in cash and no debt. Every time you go out and buy an iPhone, that number goes up a little bit. I just bought one, so I played my part. Greater than the GDP of 130 countries out of about 200. So if you want to create a genuine hierarchical understanding of the world today, first of all, perhaps it's impossible. But certainly you wouldn't just be talking about the hierarchy of nations. And there are American universities whose endowments are about half the size of Apple's cash value, but certainly larger as well than many countries in the world today. And yet this future to me looks a lot, again, like the Middle Ages, precisely because that was a period of history where we didn't just talk about the role of nations. We didn't even have nations. We didn't even have modern nation states 1,000 years ago. It was a world of overlapping identities. And so I put up this slide because many people still talk about identity and power in these traditional categories like states and nations. Because you've all heard the cliche, Facebook is the equivalent of the 3rd largest country in the world, right? And maybe 10 years from now it will have over 1 billion members in it. But that's not the right way to think about social media and identity. Your national identity is not your only kind of identity in this globalization 5.0 kind of world. You can have religious identity, ethnic identity, the causes that you belong to, the company you worked for, your corporate, your professional identity, your generational identity. So to me, don't think of social media, to the extent that it plays a role at all in allowing you to become who you want to be, as just some way of competing with your national identity. What it is just a gateway to expressing the many different kinds of identities that you do, in fact, and can have in the future. I put up this picture so you see the women in Tahrir Square. Who were they? Were they Egyptian nationalists, anti-regimists? Were they Islamists? Do they support the Muslim Brotherhood? Or are they pro-democracy? Are they conservative? Are they liberal? You can't really tell. Maybe they're all of those things at the same time. And this is just looking at one group of women in one country that's in fact been very repressed for decades. So for those of you here in privileged Western countries, you potentially have even more identities. And so we are in a world, again, that's multi-layer, that's multi-actor, multi-stakeholder, some people like to say. And if it is, then we have to think about diplomacy very differently. It's not going to be a diplomacy that's only among governments. And as I say, at least 100 of those governments are not necessarily all that wealthy or powerful or influential. And there are many universities and companies that can do far more. And so the old diplomacy, again, centralized, bureaucratically administered by core states, is giving way to something much different, in which you can have companies, NGOs, universities, researchers, all involved in solving problems. And you think about those problems much more functionally than you do based on just the nature of the actor. If you want to deal with clean energy and technology, well then you really should have Tata Energy there. If you want to deal with global public health problems, why not the Gates Foundation? After all, do you really believe the World Health Organization is the central authority in global health? What if I told you that 40% of their operating budget comes from the Gates Foundation? So we live in a world where an NGO funds an intergovernmental organization. That's the reality of diplomacy today, and it looks nothing like our 20th century maps. You want to solve climate change? Well, Walmart's supply chain emits more greenhouse gases than the country of Ireland. So who should have a seat at the table? I believe we are going back to a world in which everyone who's someone, everyone who considers themselves an authority, a knowledge authority like a university, a religious authority like a church, a corporate authority like a company, they can all have a seat at the table if they're organized, if they put their resources, their money, their manpower on the table. And that's what I call mega diplomacy. And its principles are inclusiveness, decentralization, and accountability. We'll have a world that isn't one global village, but a network of connected villages. That's what I call fragmented connectedness. And the key virtue here isn't democracy, because how do you hold a university accountable through democracy? How do you do that with a corporation? It's something so many of us struggle with when we think about things like corporate citizenship and corporate responsibility. But you can have accountability without democracy, and that comes through this mega diplomacy in which everyone is watching everyone else, everyone is monitoring everyone else. And that's going to be the only way in which we're going to deal with global problems. Because .gov, the .gov world alone, the world of governments, has brought us only so far. At least until the end of the Cold War, we thought we lived in a world run by sovereign states who work together through international organizations. But that has brought us to this world of the 21st century in which we still have more problems than we can possibly deal with. And yet the resources are in fact there. They're not only with governments, they're with NGOs, they're with companies, and of course .edu. Universities. And this to me is the nexus of public, private, civic partnerships that reflects the new model of global governance. So we don't have any more neat divides between the public sector and the private sector. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a responsibility, even universities, in setting us on the right path. So what about the role of the university in all of this? Are you getting the image up there? Here you are. The traditional model of the university is starting to be turned on its head, or education and learning. What if, because at the primary school level, before we talk about the university, let's talk about where education begins, we're already seeing that in some jurisdictions, in some areas, students are starting to do their learning at home and doing their homework at school. And they're getting personal tutoring and mentoring from teachers who are reviewing and helping them digest and incorporate and channel what is it learned. And that's what the Khan Academy is all about. I see Khan Academy is mentioned somewhere here in the program as well. The Khan Academy has already administered 67 million tutorials and is now partnering every given month with more and more school districts across the United States and internationally to do just this. Students learn at home and they go to school to do their homework, which is totally flipping this model on its head, the old model of university education. Bricks and mortar. You go through this cycle from school to university to training to a job, and then your kids are born and you make them do the exact same thing. And that's exactly what is now starting to change. So that model may be going away, but that doesn't mean that learning is going away. That doesn't mean that education is going away. I don't believe that universities themselves are at risk. I just believe their role is changing and should change to adapt to the times. And they can play a role in all of this. This being a very different way of approaching education than that traditional bricks and mortar approach. It is you, the individual, you, the student, you, the professional, you, the trainee, who looks at this menu of educational options. What will you learn through mobile technology? What will you learn from the internet? What will you learn through the mentors that you have in life, through social networks, vocational training, and university education? And over the course of your life, your learning path is going to weigh more or less in different circles from amongst these clusters. Just take the online example, online education, which reaches ever more millions of people today. We know that MIT has put so many of its curricula online. Starting last week, Stanford University began offering a course in artificial intelligence online. It has 10,000 students enrolled in it already. It's already started. Maybe it's not too late for any of you, but you will have to do some homework, even though you'll never meet your professors in person. Another thing that began this semester is something called the Floating University that was organized by Big Think, which is a website which I blog for, and many of you may have heard of. Using top faculty from Harvard and Yale, they're offering a joint class through this online floating university. You will get credits for it, you will do the homework, you will be graded by faculty from these two universities, and irrespective of where you may be sitting. And that online educational model is not just for the elite. The University of Phoenix is now one of the largest and most globally, totally online educational services that exist today. For those of you who follow stock markets, the S&P 500 is composed of these ticker symbols and letters, right? Does anyone know what D stands for? It used to be DuPont, right? The world's largest chemical company. Well, DuPont is no longer there. It's been replaced by the D of DeVry. DeVry Technical Training Academies, which is a private educational company operating out of the United States that provides courses and tutorials and vocational training for people. So this may be true that education has become a big business, like it or not, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Why? Because really only a small fraction of humanity is represented here in this room. The small fraction that is able to attend Western elite universities, liberal arts institutions that have generated and evolved over centuries. But in most of the world's nations, and for most people, most of the time, tuition-based education, fee-for-service, the fee-for-service model, in a way, is very much the norm. Even Clayton Christensen of Harvard Business School recently wrote in his own university, Harvard's magazine, saying that higher education, as it is constructed in the United States, has become a luxury service. It isn't actually affordable. Certainly not, again, to most of mankind, and certainly the billions of people coming up in emerging markets who are seeking the basic skills training for the new labor force and for future markets. Taken together, this really reinforces a point that Andrew made at the very beginning, I'm so glad you did, which is the death of pedigree. The death of pedigree. The notion that wherever you are in the world, you have to aspire to go to an elite Western university in order to be qualified, to be competent, to be seen as a candidate for a good job globally. That is disappearing far more rapidly than most Western universities are willing to admit. Right now, universities are worried about climbing into rankings. The professor mentioned that the Dutch system wants to be a top 5, broadly measured, and which is fine to have those goals and aspirations. But bear in mind that for students in emerging markets, that's not necessarily what they're looking for at all. It's great for Holland, it's great for countries that can afford it, but most actually can't do that at this point in time. And so the universities that are going to exist all around the world, that are being founded every day, either through governments that are committing the capital to them, or private companies that are creating their own vocational institutions, they don't share that aspiration. They want to process students through and give them the skills they need for the job market, and that is what they're being held accountable actually to do. So I think this brings us back to diplomacy, because the university, as it was in the Middle Ages, is in fact becoming a key force, a key actor, a player in solving some of our biggest problems. We talk about the economic crisis and the need for more job creation and innovation. Well, we've seen just how much stimulus can do, government stimulus, in creating jobs over a sustainable time frame. In fact, very, very little. It's going to be innovation that comes from companies and universities that are going to generate the ideas and the businesses that are actually going to employ people. So our biggest problem is jobs, 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 right, in Western democracies around the world. And that's not a problem that governments alone are going to solve. And let's take global challenges. We would all agree that climate change and poverty are major challenges as well. Have those been solved by bringing together just governments alone? Not as far as I can tell. You can have a summit every month, if you like to, in Bali or Copenhagen or Cancun or Kyoto, and the governments of the world are not really going to achieve a universal binding greenhouse gas emissions reductions treaty. What you could do is put all of that money from the plane tickets and, of course, the emissions that get burned in the process flying these diplomats to Bali and Copenhagen and Cancun and Kyoto, and you can put it into kind of research that universities around the world are doing into clean technology. Because bringing down the cost of innovation in those technologies and exporting those technologies to the rapidly industrializing countries outside the Western world is going to be the key to solving climate change. And hence, the work that's done at Stanford or MIT or Zurich and other universities is every bit as important to dealing with that global challenge as anything that governments do. And there's so many examples, really, of our universities around the world playing a major role in very serious issues, not just job creation and climate change and research into poverty alleviation, things like microcredit and how to scale up those kinds of schemes, but even take terrorism. I'll give you an example that relates to the United States. Since 9/11, of course, the United States has not been particularly popular in the Middle East. And yet, in precisely the last 10 years, over 40 American universities have opened up campuses in the Middle East, in the Arab world, particularly in the Persian Gulf countries. This was not motivated or supported particularly at the outset by American foreign policy. This was done despite American policy. American policy made it very difficult for qualified students from the developing world to matriculate into the places that they had been awarded in Western universities. And so the universities moved operations and created new operations and campuses right in the heart of the Arab world. And those are very popular undertakings. Students are lining up and paying and clamoring to have seats in those universities. Those are not anti-American Arabs, are they? Despite what official American policies. It is American universities that have been the best foreign policy maneuver that the United States has done, and it wasn't the government at all. It was the universities. And so even with hard issues like terrorism and countering terrorism and winning hearts and minds and educating women in particular and creating more spaces for women in universities, norms are starting to change in the Middle East step by step, bit by bit, and it has a lot to do with these 40 or 50 universities. And they're also British and European and American that have contributed to this. What it proves is that we have to look at the complicated, dangerous landscape of issues that we face in the world today, realize that we all have a responsibility in tackling them and confronting them, and see that even the university has to see itself as a player, as a diplomatic actor in this, and craft its role accordingly, which means that each of you as students, you choose what you're going to study, what internships you're going to take, and so forth, depending on working backwards from those issues to how you are going to use this educational opportunity to confront, to grapple with them, to confront them, to contribute to their resolution. So the university has to provide that opportunity, and that, to me, focusing on those problem-solving methods is going to be the way. There are lessons in this for everyone. There's lessons for the institutions themselves, universities that need to be more entrepreneurial. If you take in Great Britain, in London, British universities have partnered with the British Library to create something called the Business IP Center, in which students can go and get training in how to incorporate businesses and startup ideas and things like this, so that they can immediately have jobs upon graduating. There's lessons for professors. There's so much talk in universities about being multidisciplinary, which is to say bringing down unnecessary academic barriers. But really what most entrepreneurs and innovators say is that what they want is an environment that isn't multidisciplinary but non-disciplinary. So that means that university departments and faculty have to start to think much more about not guarding their turf and their budgets and so forth, but creating an environment where students can draw on anyone they want to. And that's something that is extremely difficult today. And as I said, there's lessons for students. To be prepared for a world, if you want to think of yourself as a new diplomat, be prepared for a world in which you don't know if you're going to be working for a government one year, a company the next year, or an NGO the year after that, or still working for the university, because the university too can be the problem solver. You have to learn general skills. Management, networking is itself a skill, and then also be a subject matter expert and focus on those skills that you can apply no matter where you're working. A lot of this, interestingly enough, and Sophie posed the question to me in an email, what risks should we be taking? Are the things that I've described, or the steps that the professor described, or the things that Andrew is talking about, are those risks? I don't think those are risks at all. Those are necessities, because the trends that I'm talking about how globalization is expanding, how it is truly global, how the playing field is level, how we have these challenges, global problems to solve that we don't have solutions for with our present institutional structure. To me, the role of a university in playing its part is not a risk, it's a necessity. It's not even a choice. You do not have a choice in the matter whatsoever. So universities have to become parallel institutions that accompany you throughout your life to help you not only learn the skills that you need to stay employable and to be productive, but also to play a role in dealing with global challenges. It begins before your gap year, it's during your gap year, it's in university itself, and it's when you get out of university. And I think that's what's going to be best for the university. It's going to be what's best for the students, and it's most certainly what's going to be best for our society as a whole. Thank you very much.